At exactly 6:42 on a Saturday morning, a brand new $9 million HOA recreation complex went dark before anyone could cut the ribbon. Music stopped. The giant display screens went black. Staff members froze in place while hundreds of residents waiting outside the entrance tried to figure out what had just happened. Less than a minute later, the HOA president was pointing straight at me. "He did this!" she yelled. "He shut us down!" I hadn't touched a power line. I hadn't called the utility company demanding they disconnect anything. The only thing I'd done was legally end an old agreement the HOA had spent months insisting didn't matter anymore. Now the very project they'd been celebrating couldn't even open. No one around me understood why. Honestly, at that moment, neither did I. I knew the agreement had ended. I knew I'd followed every legal requirement. What I didn't know was that the HOA had built an entire recreation complex around something they kept calling obsolete. Utility representatives arrived within minutes, confirming service had been suspended while they reviewed a property rights issue that had surfaced during the final stages of the opening process. Residents looked confused. Board members looked panicked. The HOA president looked furious. She kept demanding someone explain how one old agreement could stop a project that had taken years to build. The answer wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't what anyone in that parking lot expected. It all started 4 months earlier, when the HOA board looked at that same agreement, laughed, and decided it wasn't worth keeping anymore. 4 months earlier, the recreation complex was still nothing more than concrete, steel, and construction fencing. I had bigger things on my mind than the HOA. My father had passed away the year before, and I was still working through everything he left behind. Along with the ranch came decades of records, maintenance files, and one old utility corridor agreement that he'd signed long before Stonebridge Preserve even existed. Back then, there wasn't a luxury subdivision, just a few scattered homes and a utility company trying to bring electricity into the area. Dad believed neighbors ought to help each other when they could, so he signed the agreement allowing power lines to cross a small section of our property. I honored it after he was gone. Partly because it still worked, mostly because it was something he'd believed in. The problem wasn't the agreement itself. It was everything that came with it. Utility crews still needed occasional access across the ranch. Inspections had to be coordinated, and every future project on my property had to work around an arrangement that no longer fit the plans I had for the land. I wasn't looking to create problems for anyone. I simply wanted the freedom to decide what happened on my own property. Around that same time, Stonebridge Preserve announced plans for a massive recreation complex. Residents were excited. The HOA called it the biggest investment in the neighborhood's history. A few weeks later, Diane Whitmore came to see me. She carried a folder containing a copy of my father's agreement. "We're reviewing older property agreements tied to the expansion," she explained. She flipped through a few pages before stopping. "This one is pretty outdated." "It still serves a purpose," I replied. "For the utility company, maybe," she said with a shrug. "But not for anyone else." Then she slid another document across the table. "We'd actually prefer replacing it with this updated version." I scanned the first page. The proposed agreement gave broader permanent access rights than my father had ever granted. It covered additional land and removed several protections he'd specifically negotiated decades earlier. "I'll have my attorney review it," I said. A few days later, he called me. "Don't sign it. It's not a replacement. It's an expansion." So I declined. That should have ended the conversation. Instead, the HOA changed its approach. If I wouldn't replace the old agreement, they started treating the old agreement as if it had become the problem. After I rejected the new agreement, the HOA stopped talking about updating paperwork. Now they wanted the original agreement gone altogether. Melissa's emails became more direct. "If the old corridor agreement no longer meets today's needs," she wrote, "it would benefit everyone if it were voluntarily terminated." That wording caught my attention. A few weeks earlier, they wanted broader access. Now they wanted the existing agreement to disappear. My attorney noticed it too. "They tried replacing it," he said. "That didn't work. So now they're trying to convince you the original one has no value." The pressure slowly increased. The HOA began sending letters complaining that equipment stored near the utility corridor looked unattractive from neighboring streets. They couldn't actually enforce HOA rules on my ranch. My attorney pointed that out immediately, but the letters still created headaches. Each one required a response. Each one hinted that I was making life difficult for the community. Around the same time, neighborhood social media groups started repeating the same story. Apparently, I was the stubborn landowner holding up progress. I stopped reading the comments. Arguing online wasn't going to solve anything. Instead, my attorney and I focused on understanding why the HOA suddenly cared so much about an agreement they'd dismissed as outdated. That answer came from an old file cabinet. While reviewing correspondence between the original developer and the utility company, my attorney found several letters dating back years. One sentence stood out. The developer had always planned to replace my father's temporary corridor agreement with a permanent easement after later construction phases were completed. That replacement never happened. It wasn't because anyone rejected it. It just kept getting postponed during ownership changes and project transitions. I leaned back in my chair. So everyone assumed somebody else had already taken care of it. That's exactly what it looks like, my attorney replied. Before making any decisions, he contacted the utility company. We wanted to be certain they received formal notice if I chose to terminate the agreement. A representative confirmed the notice would go through the company's property rights department and explained that the agreement itself required a 90-day notice period before termination became effective. No one suggested there would be a service problem. Nothing sounded unusual. My attorney looked at me. Legally, you've done everything you should. Then he asked the question that really mattered. What do you want to do? I thought about my father. He'd signed the agreement because it helped people. I had no intention of taking that away overnight. But I also wasn't willing to replace his carefully negotiated agreement with one that permanently expanded someone else's rights over our property. After thinking it through for several days, I made my decision. I instructed my attorney to send the formal 90-day termination notice exactly as the agreement required. No surprises, no shortcuts, no attempt to catch anyone off guard. Just the process my father himself had agreed could one day be used. When Melissa received the notice, she smiled at the next board meeting and held it up for everyone to see. Looks like we finally got rid of that old agreement. Several people laughed. No one asked whether anyone outside the HOA had confirmed what ending it might actually affect. After the 90-day notice was delivered, life became surprisingly quiet. The HOA stopped sending letters. Melissa never contacted me again. From everything I could see, they believed the issue had been settled. A month later, I happened to drive past the recreation complex. Construction was nearly finished. The exterior stonework was complete. Landscapers were planting trees around the entrance. Workers were installing signs and outdoor lighting. It looked like nothing had changed. Honestly, I started wondering if I'd overestimated the importance of my father's agreement. Maybe the developer really had replaced it years ago. Maybe Melissa had been right. The utility company certainly hadn't contacted me with any concerns. Neither had the developer. When the 90-day notice finally expired, my attorney called. The termination is officially effective as of today. Anything else? No. I haven't heard a word from the utility company. Neither had I. A few days later, I received a routine letter from the utility company's property rights department. It confirmed that the termination had been processed and that their records had been updated. There were no warnings, no requests for additional information. Nothing suggested anyone expected a problem. My attorney even called the contact listed on the letter. The representative confirmed the paperwork had been completed and thanked us for handling the process properly. That conversation put both of us at ease. If the utility company had concerns, this was the perfect opportunity to raise them. They didn't. Meanwhile, Stonebridge Preserve shifted into celebration mode. The HOA announced a grand opening weekend. Residents received invitations. Food vendors were booked. Local officials confirmed they would attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Melissa proudly told homeowners the recreation complex was the beginning of a new chapter for Stonebridge Preserve. From the outside, everything appeared exactly as it should. The developer continued preparing the facility. The HOA prepared for opening day. The utility company had processed the termination. Even my attorney believed the matter was behind us. I think that's the end of it, he said. So do I. Then, 3 days before the ceremony, the utility company's compliance division began its final pre-energization review for the new recreation complex. Unlike the property rights department, the compliance team reviewed archived corridor records that hadn't been examined during the termination process. Late that afternoon, one of their attorneys found a document attached to the original corridor file. He immediately suspended the review and requested every historical record connected to the agreement. None of us knew it yet, but that forgotten document was about to stop the biggest project Stonebridge Preserve had ever built. The document the utility company's attorney found wasn't hidden. It had simply been sitting in a different archive than the records used by the Property Rights Department. Years earlier, during one of the developer transfers, the corridor agreement had been marked as scheduled for permanent replacement. From that point on, two record systems quietly drifted apart. One tracked the property agreement, the other tracked the engineering assumptions tied to it. No one realized they no longer matched. When my 90-day termination notice arrived, the Property Rights Department handled it exactly as it was supposed to. The agreement was voluntary. The notice complied with every requirement. The termination became effective. The compliance team, however, didn't review the archived engineering records until the recreation complex reached its final pre-energization inspection. That's when they found the original legal opinion. It explained that the utility's authority to serve that portion of Stonebridge Preserve depended on a permanent easement replacing my father's voluntary agreement before it expired. That replacement had never happened. The attorney immediately suspended the energization process and notified the developer. Saturday morning arrived before anyone could untangle the problem. Residents filled the parking lot. Food trucks opened. Volunteers finished decorating the entrance. Then, during the final system check before the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the power was suspended. The large display screens shut off. The lobby lights went dark. The music stopped. Utility crews arrived shortly afterward to secure the equipment, while engineers confirmed the affected circuits had been safely isolated. About an hour later, county officials suspended occupancy until lawful electrical service could be restored. That's when Melissa found me. "You knew this would happen." Her voice was shaking. I answered honestly. "I knew the agreement was ending. I knew the utility company had been notified. But I had no idea the recreation complex was still depending on it." There was a difference. My attorney and I knew the agreement remained legally important. We did not know an entirely new $9 million facility had been connected through a corridor everyone believed had already been permanently replaced. By Monday morning, local news stations were covering the failed grand opening. The developer launched an internal investigation. Archived legal files were pulled from storage. Within hours, attorneys found years of recommendations advising future management to secure the permanent easement before relying on the existing corridor for additional expansion. Each recommendation ended the same way. Handle it next phase. Finish construction first. We'll come back to it. Nobody ever did. Then another engineer noticed something else. The recreation complex wasn't the only facility tied into that corridor. Parts of the neighborhood lighting network and two nearby recreational areas were also receiving service through the same authorization. The problem was growing, and by the end of the day, everyone was heading to the county for a hearing that would determine who was actually responsible for it all.
The county hearing took place 2 days later. By then, the story had spread well beyond Stonebridge Preserve. Residents filled the meeting room. The developer brought its legal team. Representatives from the utility company sat together near the front. Melissa and the HOA board occupied one side of the room. My attorney and I sat quietly behind them. The county moderator opened the meeting. "We're here to determine why electrical service to the recreation complex could not legally be activated." The utility company's regional counsel spoke first. "Our company did not suspend service because someone filed a complaint. We suspended service because our final compliance review found that the legal authorization supporting this electrical corridor had expired." He displayed several documents on a screen. Instead of names, the timeline identified them simply as Original Corridor Agreement, Developer Transition, Permanent Easement, Pending Termination, Notice Final Compliance Review. The attorney pointed to the second entry. During a developer transition years ago, the corridor agreement was mistakenly recorded as if a permanent easement would eventually replace it. That replacement never occurred. As ownership changed, later project teams continued relying on that assumption. The developer's president stood next. "We inherited project records showing the replacement was expected to have already happened." He didn't try to shift responsibility. We should have confirmed it ourselves before expanding the electrical system. We didn't. Then the county moderator turned toward the HOA. My understanding is that the property owner informed the association the agreement remained active. Melissa nodded. He did. And your attorney also received documentation explaining that the agreement was voluntary and had not been replaced. Yes. So why continue asking him to terminate it? Melissa hesitated before answering. We believe the developer and utility already had permanent authority. That answer explained part of the story, but not all of it. My attorney stood. The HOA wasn't responsible for creating the record problem. He looked toward Melissa. But after receiving documentation showing the agreement was still active, the board chose to keep insisting it no longer mattered, instead of verifying that assumption. The room became noticeably quieter. A homeowner near the front raised his hand. So, if they'd simply checked before pushing him to end it, we probably wouldn't be sitting here? No one answered immediately. The developer's attorney finally nodded. That's a fair conclusion. The county then released its findings. The record failure explained why the developer and utility reached the point they did. The HOA's repeated demands explained why the agreement was terminated without anyone resolving that missing piece first. Responsibility didn't belong to one person, but neither did it belong equally to everyone. The developer accepted responsibility for securing the permanent easement. The HOA accepted responsibility for repeatedly dismissing evidence that should have triggered further review. The county closed the hearing by directing both parties to resolve the easement before the recreation complex could legally receive permanent electrical service. As people began leaving, reporters gathered around the developer instead of me. The story was no longer about the ranch owner. It was about how one overlooked agreement, and one assumption nobody bothered to verify, had delayed the largest project Stonebridge Preserve had ever built. 3 days later, the HOA board announced a special meeting to consider new leadership. For the first time since this all began, Melissa's position as president was no longer secure.
The developer didn't waste any time. The morning after the county hearing, their legal team contacted my attorney and asked to begin negotiating a permanent easement. This time, nobody treated it like something that could wait until later. Within a few weeks, we reached an agreement. The developer purchased a permanent utility easement across the same section of my family's property where my father had once granted temporary access. The terms were straightforward. They paid fair market value. They covered my legal costs. They also agreed to restore the affected portion of the ranch after the utility work was completed, including rebuilding the access road and replacing fencing required by the new easement. Once everything was signed, the utility company updated its records. The temporary agreement was officially retired. The permanent easement finally took its place. After final inspections, electrical service to the recreation complex was restored. A few weeks later, the HOA quietly held another opening ceremony. This one wasn't nearly as public. There were no television cameras, no speeches celebrating a historic achievement, just families finally enjoying a facility that now rested on the legal foundation it should have had from the beginning. The HOA also held a properly noticed board meeting. Melissa submitted her resignation before the meeting concluded. A new board was elected over the following weeks, and one of its first decisions was requiring independent legal verification of every major easement and property agreement before approving future capital projects. Meanwhile, I finally moved forward with the plans I'd postponed for years. The conservation retreat slowly began taking shape. Walking trails replaced old maintenance tracks. Native trees filled areas that had sat untouched for decades. The ranch finally started becoming the place I'd imagined after my father passed away. A few months later, I drove past Stonebridge Preserve again. The lights were on, the recreation complex was busy. Everything looked exactly the way the neighborhood had always hoped it would. The difference was that this time, nobody was relying on a promise that had quietly expired years after it was made. Looking back, the agreement itself was never the real problem. The real problem was assuming someone else had already taken care of it. Beat 8. Outro. Looking back, I don't think the biggest lesson was about electricity. It was about responsibility. My father never expected that one day his handshake and a few signed pages would support an entire neighborhood. He simply helped when someone asked. Over the years, that voluntary agreement quietly became something everyone depended on. The problem wasn't that it eventually ended. The problem was that too many people assumed someone else had already taken care of replacing it. When I chose to terminate it, I followed the same process my father had agreed to decades earlier. The utility company received notice. The agreement expired exactly as it was written. What happened afterward wasn't the result of one decision. It was the result of years of postponed paperwork, unchecked assumptions, and a failure to verify something that everyone thought had already been handled. In the end, the neighborhood got the permanent easement it should have secured long before the recreation complex was built. The lights came back on. The ranch moved into its next chapter, and my father's promise was remembered for what it truly was, an act of generosity, not an obligation that was meant to last forever. So let me ask you, if you were in my position, would you have continued honoring a voluntary agreement after being repeatedly told it no longer mattered? Or would you have followed the legal process, ended it properly, and trusted the responsible parties to handle the rest? I'd really like to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.